A lone woman, Alara, tends a fresh grave on a wind-scorched patch of land, her face a mask of hollow grief. The ghost of memory shows her a happier time. Her husband's laugh, the warmth of their small homestead now gone. The shadow of the man who killed him, the famous gunslinger Silas Rourke, falls over the town, his presence a dark stain on the community. Ilara's sorrow curdles into a cold, hard purpose as she looks at the toxic, beautiful flowers growing near her husband's resting place. She makes a silent vow, not with tears, but with the steady hands of a woman who has nothing left to lose. The last sound that replayed in Ilara's mind, over and over, was the single crack of the rifle. It hadn't been part of a loud gunfight. It was one clean, cruel shot from the tree line that stole the air from her husband's lungs and dropped him right there in the field, his hand still wrapped around the handle of the water bucket he was carrying for her. He was a peaceful man, a farmer named Samuel who believed a hard day's work was its own reward. He had been unarmed. He had been smiling at her just a moment before. Now, Ilara stood over the mound of raw earth that marked what was left of him. The wind, a constant presence on the high plains, whipped at her black dress and pulled strands of hair from her braid. It was the only sound now, a hollow whistle through the dry grass that was nothing like Samuel's warm laughter. Her grief was a physical weight, a stone lodged deep in her chest where her heart used to be. She felt emptied out, a vessel filled only with silence and dust. 3 days after they buried Samuel, Ilara forced herself to go into town for supplies she did not want. The town of Dust Crossing felt different. The sun beat down on the same warped wooden boardwalks. The same tired horses stood hitched outside the saloon. But the people she passed moved differently. Their eyes were downcast. Their conversations were hushed and died completely as she walked by. She felt their pity like a physical touch, and she hated it. Then she saw the reason for the new fear in the air. Silas Rourke stood outside the sheriff's office leaning against a post as if he owned it. He was a tall man, lean and hard like worn leather. His 2 Colt peacemakers hung low on his hips, their polished grips gleaming in the sun. He wasn't smiling, but there was a cold satisfaction in his eyes as he watched the townsfolk scurry past him. Everyone knew he was the one who had shot Samuel. He had bragged about it in the saloon, calling it target practice on a prairie dog. The sheriff, a cowardly man named Hobbs, had done nothing. Rourke was too fast, too feared. The law was just words on paper when faced with a man like that. Ilara stood frozen on the boardwalk, her basket hanging limp from her hand. She watched Silas Rourke laugh at something one of his men said, a short, sharp sound that carried across the street. That sound cut through the fog of her sorrow. It was a spark on dry tinder. The heavy, aching sadness inside her began to shift. It heated and tightened, hardening into something else entirely. Became a cold, sharp knot of purpose. She turned away, her steps no longer aimless. She walked straight out of town, back toward the emptiness of her farm. She did not look back. When she reached Samuel's grave, she didn't fall to her knees weeping. She stood tall and looked at the land around her. Her eyes fell on a cluster of flowers growing near the fence line. They were strikingly beautiful, with hooded, deep purple blossoms. Wolf's bane. Samuel had always warned her about them. He'd pointed them out when they first settled the land, telling her the roots could kill a large wolf in minutes. A man would take even less time. Ilara walked to the patch of flowers and knelt. She took her time, selecting the most vibrant blooms. Her hands, which had trembled for days, were now perfectly steady. She carefully dug up the roots, her mind clear and focused. There was no hesitation, no second thought. The memory of Samuel's smile was now a fuel for the fire burning inside her. Not a reason to weep. Justice was a concept for courts and sheriffs. This land only understood strength and consequence. She would give Silas Rourke a consequence he never saw coming. She carried the plants into her small, dark cabin. Using Samuel's mortar and pestle, she began to grind the roots into a fine, dark paste. The sweet, earthy scent that filled the room felt like a betrayal of Samuel's memory. But she pushed the feeling down. This was for him. This was the only language a man like Rourke understood. She would speak it fluently. She worked late into the night, her face illuminated by a single lantern. The paste she dried into a gritty brown powder. She found an old, small glass vial that had once held medicine for a sick calf Samuel had nursed back to health. She filled it with the powder and corked it shut. The tiny vial felt heavy in her hand. containing the end of a story that hadn't been written yet. She looked out the window into the pitch-black night, the vial clutched tightly in her fist. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of her promise. Tomorrow she would go back to town. She would walk into the lion's den, and she would feed him poison. Ilara grinds the deep purple petals of the wolf's bane flower into a fine, deadly powder, her cabin filled with a sweet, poisonous scent. She enters the raucous saloon where Silas Rourke holds court, a world of violence and vice that stole her peace. With a calm that terrifies the bartender, she spikes Rourke's favorite bottle of whiskey, her heart pounding not with fear, but with grim anticipation. She watches from the shadows as the arrogant gunslinger drinks the tainted liquor, toasting to his own invincibility. The chapter ends not with his death, but with the first cough, a wet, ragged sound that signals the beginning of the end. The next morning, Ilara awoke not to grief, but to resolve. The tiny glass vial felt cold against her skin, where she had tucked it into a small pocket sewn into her dress. She moved through the empty cabin with a chilling efficiency. She made a simple breakfast she did not eat. She looked at Samuel's chair but did not cry. Her emotions were locked away, frozen solid beneath a layer of pure intent. She knew Silas Rourke's habits because the whole town knew them. He held court every afternoon at the Lucky Dollar Saloon, holding the entire place hostage with his presence. He always drank from the same bottle, expensive-looking whiskey he kept behind the bar, a symbol that even the town's liquor belonged to him. Ilara waited until the sun was high, then put on her wide-brimmed hat, and began the long walk back to Dusk Crossing. Her heart was not pounding with fear. It beat a slow, steady, and grim rhythm of anticipation. The Lucky Dollar was everything she hated. The noise of drunken laughter and off-key piano music hit her first, a jarring assault after the silence of her homestead. She pushed through the swinging doors, and the smell of cheap tobacco, cheaper whiskey, and unwashed men made her stomach turn. For a moment, the chaos seemed to pause. Men turned to look at the widow in her black dress standing in the doorway of their den of vice. Their stares were a mix of curiosity and unease. Ilara ignored them all. Her eyes scanned the room and found him immediately. Silas Rourke was holding a deck of cards, holding a table of other rough-looking men under his thumb. He was smiling, a cruel, thin-lipped expression that never reached his cold eyes. Seeing him there, alive and thriving while Samuel was in the ground, was like a physical blow. It solidified her purpose, turning her nervous energy into steel. Ilara did not look at Rourke again. She turned and walked straight to the bar. The bartender, a large man named Clyde with a stained apron, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, This ain't no place for you." Ilara fixed him with a flat, emotionless stare. Her calmness was more terrifying than any anger would have been. "I am not staying," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the saloon's noise. "I need a bottle. The good one, for a remembrance. For my husband." She placed a few coins on the counter, her hand not shaking. Clyde's eyes darted toward Silas Rourke's table and then back to her. He understood the unspoken rule. Nobody touched Rourke's bottle. But the look in the widow's eyes, the eerie stillness of her, made him hesitate. He was a man used to loud threats and posturing, not this quiet, terrifying resolve. Muttering under his breath, he turned and grabbed the distinct, unlabeled bottle from the top shelf. This was the moment. Clyde set the bottle on the bar top and turned to get a glass. It took only a second. Ilara's movements were swift and hidden by the bar's edge. Her hand dipped into her pocket, pulled out the vial and uncorked it with her thumb. She poured the entire contents of the fine brown powder into the bottle. She gave it a quick, silent shake just as Clyde turned back with a clean glass. The powder dissolved into the amber liquid, leaving no trace. Her heart was a hammer in her chest now, but her face remained a placid mask. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She left the coins on the bar, took the bottle, and turned to leave. She felt the eyes of the room on her again, but this time they were just confused. They saw a grieving widow buying a bottle of courage. They did not see an assassin walking out into the afternoon sun. She did not go home. She walked to the livery stable across the street and found a shadowy spot in the hayloft, a small gap in the wood planks that gave her a perfect hidden view into the saloon's main window. And she waited. It did not take long. About 20 minutes after she left, she saw Clyde nervously approach Rourke's table. He said a few words, gesturing toward the bottle that was now back on the shelf. Rourke's head snapped up, his expression darkening. Ilara's breath caught. Had the bartender told him? Was her plan already over? But then Rourke's face broke into a wide, arrogant grin. He said something loud and his whole table laughed. He stood up, clapped Clyde on the back a little too hard, and strode to the bar. He grabbed the bottle and held it aloft for the whole saloon to see. "Seems the widow has fine taste," he boasted, his voice carrying easily across the street, a final tribute to the farmer. "Let's not let it go to waste." He poured a generous amount into his glass and raised it in a mocking toast toward the window, toward the unseen Ilara, before throwing it back in one gulp. He poured another immediately, drinking deeply again. He had swallowed her vengeance twice and called it a tribute. The cruel irony made Ilara feel sick, but she did not look away. She watched him for an hour. He grew louder, more boisterous, slapping cards on the table. He drank more of the poisoned whiskey, believing it was his finest hour. Then, during a particularly loud laugh, he suddenly stopped. His laughter cut off into a sharp, choked sound. He brought his hand to his throat. His face, once flushed with drink, began to pale. A sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. One of his men, a scarred fellow named Jep, leaned over. "You all right, Silas?" Rourke waved him off, but the gesture was weak. He tried to take another drink, but his hand was unsteady. He coughed a dry, hacking sound. He tried to stand, to perhaps regain his composure in private, but his legs seemed to buckle under him. He slumped back into his chair. The men at his table were quiet now, watching him with confusion. This was not the effects of whiskey. Rourke's body convulsed with another cough, this one deeper, wetter. It was a horrible, ragged sound that tore from his chest. He looked down at his hand, and even from across the street, Ilara saw the faint speckle of blood that now dotted his palm. His eyes widened in pure, uncomprehending shock. The invincible Silas Rourke was afraid. And in the dusty hayloft, Ilara finally allowed herself a single, shuddering breath. It had begun. The war was not over. It had just declared its first casualty in a way no one would expect. Silas Rourke dies not in a blaze of glory, but in a feverish, undignified heap, his legend shattered by a mystery illness. His ruthless gang, the Crimson Hounds, descends on the town like vultures, convinced their leader was murdered by a rival faction. They accuse a peaceful rancher, a man who had once stood up to Rourke's bullying, and string him up without a trial. This single act of brutal injustice ignites the tinderbox of the territory. Neighbors take up arms against the gang, and the rancher's allies swear blood feud. Ilara watches in horror as her personal act of revenge explodes into an open war, trapping the innocent town in the crossfire. Ilara watched from the hayloft as chaos erupted inside the Lucky Dollar. Silas Rourke's coughs grew worse, each one a wet, tearing gasp that shook his entire frame. His men crowded around him, their faces masks of confusion and growing fear. They carried him, stumbling and bleeding from his lips, up the stairs to a rented room above the saloon. The town doctor was summoned, a tired old man named Higgins, who emerged an hour later wiping his brow with a handkerchief, his expression grim and utterly baffled. He had no answers. It was like no illness he had ever seen. For 2 days, the town held its breath. The only sounds from that upstairs room were the ragged, desperate struggles for air of a drowning man on dry land. On the third morning, a profound silence fell over Dust Crossing. "Jep," the scarred lieutenant walked out onto the balcony and spat into the dust below. He didn't need to say a word. Everyone knew. Silas Rourke was dead. The man who had terrorized the territory for a decade was gone, not in a hail of bullets, but alone in a sweat-soaked bed, wasted away to nothing. The news should have brought relief. It brought only a deeper, more terrifying tension. By noon, the rest of the Crimson Hounds rode into town, 15 hard men on lathered horses, their faces set in grim fury. They gathered in the saloon, their voices low and angry. Jep stood before them, laying out the facts as he saw them. Silas was healthy. Silas drank from his bottle. Silas died in agony. "This warn't no sickness," Jep snarled, slamming his fist on the bar. "This was poison. This was an act of war. They needed a target, someone to blame for this insult. Their pride could not accept that their legendary leader had been brought down by something so simple and cowardly as a sickness. They refused to believe their invincibility had died with him. They needed an enemy, and their eyes turned outward to the other powers in the territory. They immediately suspected the Larson brothers, a family of ranchers who controlled the water rights to the north. Silas had been trying to strong-arm them for months. But one of the younger hounds, a hothead named Cooley, shouted a different name. What about that rancher? The one who mouthed off to Silas last week? The one with the big spread east of here? Vance. He threatened Silas right to his face. Gareth Vance was a stubborn, hard-working man who loved his land and his cattle. He was no gunfighter. A week earlier, Rourke and his men had tried to run off a dozen of Vance's prime steers. Vance had stood his ground, telling Rourke he would have to shoot him to take them. It was a moment of brave defiance the whole town had secretly applauded. Now it was a death sentence. The hounds, whipped into a frenzy by Jep and Cooley, stormed out of the saloon. They found Vance in the general store, buying nails and flour. They dragged him out into the street by his collar, ignoring his protests and the terrified cries of the storekeeper. A crowd gathered, but they were unarmed farmers and shopkeepers facing 15 ruthless killers. Jep put a rope around Vance's neck. Vance stared at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This is madness. I had nothing to do with it," he yelled, his voice cracking. Jep's face was stone. "You challenged him. You wanted him dead. Now you can join him." They threw the other end of the rope over the sturdy beam that supported the water trough's awning. There was no trial. There were no last words. They hauled him up right there in the center of town. A brutal and swift execution meant to send a message to anyone who might have celebrated Rourke's death. Elara watched the entire horrific scene from the edge of the crowd, her hand clamped over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. The cold satisfaction she had felt in the hayloft evaporated, replaced by a freezing, gut-wrenching terror. This was her doing. She had poured the poison, but the Crimson Hounds were the ones who lit the match. They had just burned an innocent man alive in the town square to prove a point. As Vance's body swung slowly in the hot breeze, a terrible silence fell. Then a single shot rang out. It came from the roof of the blacksmith's shop. One of Vance's hired men, a young cowboy who had been in love with Vance's daughter, had finally found his courage. The bullet took Cooley in the shoulder, spinning him around. The spell was broken. The hounds drew their guns, fanning out and firing wildly toward the roof. The townspeople screamed and scattered, running for cover. The war had begun. It was not a war between outlaws and lawmen. It was a war between the hounds and every soul in the territory who had ever suffered under Rourke's boot. Men who had been too afraid to fight for themselves now found a reason to fight for Vance. Elara retreated to the relative safety of the livery stable, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peeked through a crack in the wall. She saw farmers she knew, men who raised crops now firing rifles from behind water barrels. She saw the hounds taking cover behind the gallows they had just built, using Vance's body as a shield. The air was thick with gun smoke and the screams of the wounded. This was her revenge. This was the consequence of her quiet, personal poison. It was not justice. It was a wildfire, and she had provided the spark. She thought only Silas Rourke would fall. She never imagined he would drag the entire town into the grave with him. The weight of what she had done settled on her shoulders, heavier than any grief she had carried before. She had wanted to balance the scales for Samuel, but she had instead shattered them, unleashing a violence that would consume everything in its path. As the battle raged in the street, a new sickening fear took root in her soul, a fear far greater than any she had felt for herself. The ghosts of her past were gone, replaced by the very real and bleeding present she had created. She had to stop it, but the fire was already burning out of control. The town becomes a battlefield. Bullets fly where children once played, and smoke replaces the smell of baking bread. Seeing the devastation she unknowingly caused, Elara is gutted by a new, profound guilt far deeper than her grief. She makes a desperate choice. She stands before both sides in the main street and confesses everything, revealing her motive and her method. A stunned silence falls. The war, built on a lie, suddenly has no foundation. The fighting stops, but the cost is counted in the dead. The final scene shows Elara leaving the scarred town behind, walking into the vast emptiness of the frontier, forever carrying the weight of her peace. Paid for with the blood of many, the battle for Dust Crossing raged for a full day and night. The main street became a nightmare. Bullets whined through the air, shattering windows and chewing splinters from the wooden buildings. Thick black smoke curled from the shell of the general store, hit by a stray lantern oil fire. The air, once clean and dry, was choked with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the coppery scent of blood. Men who had been neighbors and customers just days before now shot at each other from behind overturned wagons and water troughs. A young boy, no older than 10, lay dead in the dust near the saloon steps, caught in the crossfire. His body was a stark, terrible monument to the madness that had consumed them all. Ilara huddled inside the livery stable, watching the horror unfold through a crack in the door. Every gunshot felt like a nail in her conscience. Every cry of pain was a direct accusation. She had wanted to avenge one death. She had instead opened the gates of hell and unleashed a slaughter. The cold purpose that had driven her was gone, melted away by the heat of the violence she had sparked. In its place was a guilt so heavy it made it hard to breathe. This was her harvest, and it was nothing but ashes. As the second day dawned, the fighting had settled into a grim stalemate. The townsfolk and ranchers, led by Vance's hardened cowhands, held the north end of the street. The Crimson Hounds, vicious and cornered, controlled the south end from the saloon. The body of Gareth Vance still swung gently from the awning beam, a constant grim reminder of why this had all started. Ilara knew the truth. The reason was a lie. The hounds fought for a revenge that was misplaced. The townsfolk fought against a crime that never happened. She looked at the face of the dead boy in the street, and something inside her broke. Her grief for Samuel was still there, a permanent scar on her soul. But it was now overshadowed by the screaming, immediate guilt for all this death. Her personal vengeance was a tiny, selfish thing compared to the colossal tragedy unfolding before her. She had to stop it. There was only one way. She would have to give them the truth. It would mean her life, but her life was a small price to pay if it could end the killing. She stood up, her legs shaky. She smoothed down her dirty black dress and walked to the stable door. She did not have a plan. She only had a desperate need to speak. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the smoky morning air. She walked slowly into the center of the street, directly into the no-man's land between the two factions. "Stop!" she cried out, her voice thin and strained against the occasional crack of a rifle. "Please stop." A bullet kicked up dirt near her feet, but she did not flinch. She kept walking until she stood directly between the two sides, directly below Gareth Vance's body. "Look at me," she screamed, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she had. The shooting sputtered and then ceased. Dozens of eyes from both sides stared at her. They saw the widow, the woman who had lost her husband, standing in the crossfire. They expected her to beg for peace. They did not expect what came next. Silas Rourke was not murdered by Gareth Vance, she yelled, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "He was not murdered by any of you. I did it!" A confused murmur ran through the crowd. Jep, the hound's leader, stepped out from behind the saloon doors, his pistol aimed at her. "What nonsense is this, woman?" he snarled. Ilara turned to face him, her chin held high. "It is the truth. He murdered my husband in cold blood. The law did nothing, so I did. I took the wolf's bane that grows on my land. I ground it into powder. I came into that saloon and I put it in his bottle of whiskey." She pointed a trembling finger at the bartender, Clyde, who was peeking from a shattered window. "He saw me buy it. He saw me leave. I watched from the hayloft as Rourke drank it and praised my poor Samuel's name while he did it." Her confession hung in the air, stark and unbelievable. The twisted poetry of it, the brutal simplicity, was utterly convincing. The fight went out of the hounds. Their rage had been built on the idea of a rival gang's ambush, a warrior's death betrayed. This was just a woman. This was poison. It was not a battle cry. It was a humiliation. The townsfolk lowered their weapons, staring in stunned silence. The war had no reason to continue. Jep lowered his gun, his face a mixture of disgust and shocking defeat. He looked at his men, then at the armed townsfolk, and finally at Ilara. The truth had disarmed them all more completely than any battle could have. There was nothing to fight for anymore. "Get the body," Jep muttered to his men, not looking at Vance. "We're leaving this cursed town." The hounds moved slowly, gathering their dead, their bravado gone. They rode out without another word, leaving behind the wreckage and their dead leader upstairs. The townspeople emerged from their cover, staring at the destruction and the bodies of their own loved ones. They looked at Alara, but their eyes were not filled with gratitude. They were filled with a hollow, weary confusion. She had ended the war, but she had also started it. She was both savior and destroyer. There was no place for her here anymore. She had brought down a tyrant, but the cost was written in the blood staining the dirt street and the smoke staining the sky. She turned her back on them all and started walking. She walked past the graves, past the boundary of her old life and out into the open frontier. She carried no water, no food, nothing but the clothes on her back. She did not know where she was going, only that she could not stay. The price for her peace had been paid, but it was a debt settled with the blood of the innocent, and that was a weight she would have to carry alone, forever.